Brian, thank you for the introduction. Chris, thank you for the invitation. And thanks to Inspire and CEREO for quite a fascinating day we've had, and also for the great work that you're doing in doing integrated science. How many English majors are there here? Okay, one. You don't have to answer this question. Okay, so why would I have a couplet from Samuel Taylor Coleridge on the screen up here? From the Ancient Mariner, you know, the albatross died, all these sailors surrounded by water, but they're dying because it's the wrong kind of water. So, okay, she's nodding her head that she knows the answer. So liberal arts education is really important. I trust that. So surrounded by water, the wrong kind of water. We're surrounded by nitrogen, the wrong kind of nitrogen. Systems, all living systems, need nitrogen. And so today, Allie and I are going to tell the story about human use of nitrogen, where it happens, what it does, and how humans can come back and help take care of some of those problems. Okay, wrong button, right, there we go. So that's my slide, and now Allie's going to take over and give the rest of the talk. So I'm going to give the first half, and then Allie will come in and give the last half. So we have over 10 million species, biological species, on the surface of the Earth, just counting the terrestrial systems. Everything needs nitrogen to survive. But the world is limited by nitrogen. Most ecosystems in the world are limited by nitrogen because there's less than 1,000 species can actually take N2 out of the atmosphere and convert it to what we call bioactive or reactive nitrogen, which in the broad terms, reactive nitrogen is any nitrogen species except the molecule N2. Includes NOx, ammonia, ammonium, and organic nitrogen, of course. And so the challenge is, how did these world systems develop with such a critically important element not available to everything? Well, clearly it reached an equilibrium between nitrogen supply from biological nitrification and nitrogen conversion back to N2 by denitrification. And so in the absence of humans, the world was in balance with respect to nitrogen. In addition to biological nitrogen fixation, natural sources of nitrogen are lightning. So on the big global scale, natural creation of reactive nitrogen by biological nitrogen fixation in terrestrial systems is about 100. I'll come back to that later on. For lightning, it's around 5 teragrams, million metric tons, 10 to the 12th grams for those of you who don't know the units. So let's add people to the mix. And so people have become very efficient at converting N2 to reactive nitrogen. We do it when we burn fossil fuels. We make the molecule NO, nitric oxide. We do it when we plant soybeans or other legumes. We enhance biological nitrogen fixation or cultivation-induced biological nitrogen fixation. And of course we do it by the Haber-Bosch process, that wonderful invention in 1908 where you can take H2 and N2 and a high temperature and a catalyst and you make the molecule ammonia. You know, one of these days I'm going to get this right. And so today, what Allie and I will do is give you a history lesson. I'll talk to you about the fate of nitrogen during food and energy production. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the results from the report that Brian mentioned, the Integrated Nitrogen Committee of the USA Science Advisory Board. And then I'm going to transition over to Allison, who will talk to you about the nitrogen calculator that we've developed and how we've developed one for an institution that WSCU might take into account. Okay, now, if you look to your left, that's how reactive nitrogen was created. There's that paddy field. You had animal power. You had human power there making rice. You had that cow on a grassy field converting cellulose to a protein. And then you had biofuels, the original biofuels, forests. So that's where we got our grain, we got our meat, and we got our energy. Now again, it doesn't take an English major to know this. You should all know the answer to this question. If you know the answer, you can raise your hand, but I don't want you to tell the answer. And I expect everybody, given that this is a land-grant university, to know the answer to this question. So I expect everyone to raise their hands. What kind of cow is that? Okay, not bad. Best of any audience I've done. That is a belted Galloway. Okay, you can see the resemblance. Broad forehead, nose, belt. Seriously, it's a great way of making protein. So you have this thing with a rumen that converts cellulose to things that other species can use. And that's how we used to make protein via animals without killing the animal. Now, we have monocultures of grain for grain production. And the drive that Chris gave us yesterday, beautiful drive. You have a beautiful countryside here. And this is a great example of that countryside. You have meat production. That feedlot with the mountains in the background, the little snow on the mountains, okay, making meat that way. And then you have energy production, of course, from the fossil fuel as opposed to the original biofuel. What about the history lesson? Well, this requires some pointing with a pointer. I understand that people in the remote audiences aren't able to see this, and so let me use the pointer. It's showing up on the screen. Yep. So this is, on this axis, billions of people with time from 1850 to the year 2000, 2005, around 6 billion people. We're now at 7 billion people. You can see that fossil fuel combustion, going small here, is around now 25 million metric tons created by humans on a global basis. Planting of legumes. Originally, this was the original anthropogenic source of reactive nitrogen, was legume cultivation. Thousands of years ago, people realized, hey, if we plant something else after we plant this kind of beanie crop, we get a better yield. And so it was a common knowledge, common wisdom that led legumes to be a staple of agricultural production. And then with time, this has increased by about a factor of 2 over the last 160 years or so. And then we had the Haber-Bosch process come in, this production of ammonia from N2 and H2. And as I mentioned the year 1908, that's when Fritz Haber filed the patent for the creation of ammonia from its elements, N2 and H2. It wasn't until the mid-50s that it really took off as a fertilizer on a global basis. The story of Haber and Bosch is fascinating, beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But if you're interested in the intersection of science and society, broadly defined, it's a story to read. I refer you to Václav Smil's book, Enriching the Earth, MIT Press, 2001. The reason Haber and Bosch created the Haber-Bosch process had nothing to do with the fact that Sir William Crookes in 1898 told the British Association for the Advancement of Science that the civilized world was running out of nitrogen and the chemists had to solve the problem. That's what he said, and he challenged the chemists to make use of all this N2 in the atmosphere. Now, when Crookes said the civilized world, I know he was talking about the UK in 1898, probably, maybe France, maybe Germany, certainly not the United States. Nonetheless, the point was made that there wasn't enough naturally occurring nitrogen to grow food and feed for a growing population. Haber and Bosch stepped in. They did not care as much about providing a nutrient source for food production as they did about the fact that Germany was about to enter conflict of World War I, it was blockaded, and they needed to have a source of nitrate to make munitions. That was the driver for the Haber-Bosch process. Jan Willem Arisman in 2008, on the 100th anniversary of the filing of the patent by Haber, did a calculation saying that if the Haber-Bosch process had not been invented in 1908, that we would, instead of having 7 billion people, the maximum capacity of the world was around 4 billion people. Now, we can argue for a long time about whether that's good or bad, but still, about 50% of the world's population is now sustained by the Haber-Bosch process. He also did another calculation. He said, well, if we've created a world, added 3 billion people to the world because of the Haber-Bosch process, how many people have we killed due to the munitions created by the Haber-Bosch process? And he added up. Well, I was a co-author. We added up all the people killed in the wars since that time, and it turns out that it's hundreds of millions. So again, 3 billion, hundreds of millions, 3 billion fed, hundreds of millions killed. Again, that's a topic for a graduate thesis about how you set the value judgments on that. But maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. So now we have this total, and this is around 190 million metric tons, anthropogenic. We contrast this to the natural range, terrestrial, which is around 90 to 120. And we see that in around 1970, humans became better than nature at making reactive nitrogen, putting this limiting, ecologically limiting element in a reactive form into the world's ecosystems. That's the history lesson. Now we ask the question, if humans are creating all of this reactive nitrogen, where does it go? And then later on, we'll ask the question, what does it do when it gets there? Well, where it goes, in the atmosphere, this is from a paper that we published. Frank Gentner was one of the authors. This are his model outputs. So you have 1860. This is nitrogen deposition to the world, milligrams of nitrogen per meter squared per year. And you can see there's some signature, footprint, if you will, of human action. North America, Western Europe, a little bit in South America, a large amount in India, the Ganges River Valley. And we've asked the question, well, what was it? Well, you guys, this is an animal science building, is that right? We're near the animal science building, if we're not in it, okay? It was cattle. It was livestock causing this imprint, this footprint of nitrogen deposition in 1860. We move over to the year 2000. Here's what it looks like. Okay, and this is due in part due to increased fossil fuel combustion, in large part due to emissions of ammonia to the atmosphere from agriculture. If I was to show you a map for the year 2050, the projections, the northern hemisphere would essentially turn red and orange, okay, as you had, especially from Asia, increasing the animal agriculture and energy production systems. So some of the reactive nitrogen forms goes up in the air, and then it's transported, transformed, and comes down. And these maps depict the coming down. We also have reactive nitrogen transported to the edges of the continents to rivers. In 1890, there were records of about 1920, 6 coastal ecosystems that people noted increased production due to animal waste or sewage coming into the coastal system. Now there's over 600 of these noted. Another interesting thing, and perhaps we can get to this in the question and answer period, in the mid-1950s, common wisdom was that it was good to put nitrogen into coastal systems because you increased production, increased food source, and you would then therefore increase fisheries. Now, of course, we know that that's not the case, and we'll come back to this in a second. Okay, that's the history. That's the formation with time, that's the fate, and now we move to a key question. Let's consider that we're all not like Garrison's Keeler people, but let's just say we're all average. The average person needs about 2 kilograms, needs to ingest about 2 kilograms per person per year of nitrogen just to maintain our average, our functioning. Okay, you multiply that times the population, when I did this calculation of the world, 6.5 billion. It's high math, 6.5 times, 2 kilograms, sorry, I screwed that one up. Okay, 2 times 6.5 is 13. So the global population only needs 13 teragrams of reactive nitrogen to be created by the food production process. The global population consumes 30 teragrams. But we use 140 teragrams of reactive nitrogen globally to make food. And why is that? What is it about the food production process that makes it so necessary to overproduce reactive nitrogen by an order of magnitude? Well, you all are better experts at this than I am, but using results from work here and other places, we can think about nitrogen as a very leaky element. So here we have, to the left, We have nitrogen inputs, fertilizer, biological nitrogen fixation due to human action. We have, depending on crop type, crop area management, we have losses of ammonia, N2O, NOx to the atmosphere and also to groundwater and surface waters of these nitrogen flavors. And so only about 20% of the crops produced using this reactive nitrogen is consumed, enters a human mouth. The rest, that other 80%, is lost to the atmosphere, lost to the surface and groundwaters. Some is converted to N2, but most is not. And so in other talks that Allie and I give, we show different menus. Allison's a vegetarian. I'm dyed-in-the-wool carnivore, and we're able to show how the footprints change when you become a Jim to an Allie. Well, you see that meat's missing from here. I haven't put meat on here. So what about meat? How's that change? So there's overconsumption of meat happening on this planet. Okay, here you have what I'm told by my zoological colleagues is a really big snake eating a really big, I said cow, but they said it's not a cow. It's something that's still really big. And so if you then do the same calculation for meat consumption, you see that a large part of the crop production goes to feed, and then depending on the type, the number, the management of the animal, you have these losses to the atmosphere, and you have these losses to ground and surface waters, and of the 10% only of the nitrogen used in meat production, only 10% enters the human mouth. So it's not a stretch to say that most of the nitrogen that is, not a stretch to say all of the nitrogen that's used in food production of crops and animals is lost to the environment. You say, well, wait a minute, you have some of this is consumed for human good. Yeah, but we're not getting bigger with respect to nitrogen. So we excrete all the nitrogen that we consume unless you're putting on muscle mass. And that is a nitrogen loss. And so the key part of this is that we have a pretty big issue to deal with. We have a needed commodity, nitrogen, to grow crops, to grow feed, to grow animal protein. You have, as we'll see in a second, some pretty serious environmental issues associated with the fact that all of this nitrogen, 200 million metric tons on a global basis compared to about 100 from natural systems, is lost in the environment. So let me do a short summing up slide here. We have in energy production, I didn't talk about this, but this is reactive nitrogen production by accident. It's like carbon dioxide, only more interesting. Okay, you have fossil fuel combustion, nitrogen dioxide formed, and that's directly emitted to the atmospheric environment. You have then food production, and some going into this grain system, some going over to feed people. This is a German family. This is from a book by Menzel and DeLucio, Feeding the World, or The Food We Eat. It has pictures of the average weekly consumption of food from about 25 different countries. This is the German family. If I showed you an American family, it would look about the same. That is the food that they consume in 1 week. And then, so they eat some meat, and then you have a direct loss, think manure, think ammonia emissions, to the environment. I think I have to confess to you right here. I'll save the confession for later on. Okay, I've lied to you, but I'll correct it later on. Okay, what about this green bar? Okay, this green bar, this environment. So you have all this stuff, nitrogen, going into the environment. What's it do? Well, first, if it's in the atmosphere, it contributes to the formation of nitric acid. It contributes to the formation of ozone. It's the particle formation of haze. Once it's deposited to a forest or grassland ecosystem, you can have over-fertilization of the system. You can have loss of biodiversity in both forests and grasslands. It's a complicated picture, but you do have biodiversity losses attributed to excess nitrogen deposition. Once the nitrogen leaves the forest, especially at a high altitude, and goes into a low alkalinity freshwater system, you have acidification of lakes and streams with resulting loss of biodiversity. Once you have nitrogen put into the stratosphere, you have destruction of the ozone hole, And then once it stays in the troposphere, you have global warming. And once it's, so let me say, these slides should have gone, sorry, forest dieback, acidification, then coastal systems, you have eutrophication, then global warming due to N2O and ozone in the stratosphere, in the troposphere, and then you have stratospheric ozone depletion. Now with the Montreal Protocol, which diminished the amount of CFCs that get to the stratosphere, N2O is now the largest destroyer of stratospheric ozone, most largest anthropogenic destroyer of stratospheric ozone. And I mentioned that CO2 is a little boring. It is pretty boring because the neat thing about nitrogen from a biogeochemical point of view is that all of these things are connected in what we call the nitrogen cascade. So let's pretend that I'm a molecule of nitrogen, of nitric oxide, that's just come out of a car tailpipe or a smokestack. The first thing I do is I contribute to ozone in the troposphere. Then I can contribute to decreased visibility. And then I'm deposited, I contribute to forest dieback. And then I'm leached to a surface water. And then that same nitrogen molecule contributes to the acidification of surface waters. And then I go to the coast. I increase production, perhaps enhance eutrophication. And then I hit a patch where I can be denitrified and form nitrous oxide. And I build up in the troposphere and contribute to global warming. And then I diffuse into the stratosphere, whereas my last gasp of activity, I destroy stratospheric ozone. That's one nitrogen atom. Keep in mind that we, every year, are putting more and more nitrogen, anthropogenic nitrogen, into the system, and the amount of reactive nitrogen being converted back to N2 by that natural process, denitrification, is less than what humans are creating every year. So you have a nitrogen enhancement system. Okay, I promised you this report. This report was 5 years in the making. It's the first large-scale synthesis of reactive nitrogen in the U.S. environment, and it has several bottom lines. I'll tell you what the sources of nitrogen to the U.S. sources are. You have the natural source of around 6 million metric tons, or 6 teragrams. Then you have the energy sources. Then you have this cultivation-induced biological nitrogen fixation. Then you have the Haber-Bosch fertilizer. And then you have Haber-Bosch industry, 4.2. What does that mean? What Haber-Bosch industry? Well, think about nylon. Think about explosives. About 25% of the Haber-Bosch nitrogen that's created goes not to fertilizer, but as industrial feedstock. And so on a global basis, this is as much nitrogen as is put in the environment from combustion of fossil fuels. And we know so little about the life cycle of this nitrogen here. We know it's being created. We know it's going into products or being used in production. We don't know its fate. It's an unknown that needs to become known. How do you control this? How do you manage this? And so the mantra of most nitrogen studies these days that have a policy component is, how can you maximize the benefits of reactive nitrogen for society, yet minimize the negative consequences to people and ecosystems? And so you ask three fundamental questions. Where's reactive nitrogen creation occurring that we don't need it to occur? How can reactive nitrogen use be made more efficient? And if you need to use it and you have waste, how can they be managed? So, you've seen this picture before. I'm going to use it for a different purpose now. I'm going to show you the choke points or control points in this system for the United States. They also apply for the world, as it turns out, for reactive nitrogen. If you use currently available technology to decrease NOx emissions from the atmosphere in fossil fuel combustion, you can make this number very small. If you, and you all are working on this, if you increase nutrient use efficiency by crops, you can decrease the amount of fertilizer needed for the system. If you feed your animals better, learn how to manage animals' production better. I'm not talking about changing the flavor. I'm just talking about managing, getting the nitrogen, more of the nitrogen into the animal protein product to be consumed and less out the back end, then that number can decrease. And then if you deal with manure better and human waste better, we were talking earlier today in a meeting, and we made the point that for the United States, this developed country, only 5% of the human sewage created goes through a denitrification step. Only 5%. The countries of Western Europe have us beat by several factors. They're in the 60 to 70% range. So if you do all that, then you can, using best available control technologies, you can decrease the amount of reactive nitrogen needed to be created in the US and the world by 25%. Now let me correct something that I lied to you about. So I said this was a feedlot. That's true. I said these were mountains covered by snow. That's not true. That's not true. I see you shaking your head. This is a great picture. This is a burning pile of manure in Kansas. It burned for months before they were able to put it out. So this is a resource. This is a resource that can be used. This is what I call the top-down approach to reactive nitrogen management. Okay, you have people talking to the farmers. You have EPA regulating how much NOx is put in the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion. You have the government forcing localities to put in advanced wastewater treatment processes. You have better manure management mandated by the government. That's a top-down approach. There's a bottom-up approach also. And that involves all of us. We get asked often, well, what can I do to help decrease the amount of reactive nitrogen lost to the environment due to my lifestyle? Well, there are two things. We collectively as a nation waste about 35% of the food that we either purchase in the grocery store or prepare for ourselves. Think of that moldy stuff in the back of the fridge, okay? Think about that, the time you open the container and you say, is this too old to eat? And we're generally pretty prudent people, so we might pitch it. 35% of that food is wasted, is lost. All that nitrogen capital invested in that food is lost. The other side is right here. Consumption of animal protein. Now let's expand it out to consumption of protein. The USDA is a wonderful organization. It gives us guidelines about calories we should eat, fat, sugary things. It also tells us how much protein a person should ingest. On average, the citizen of the United States consumes about 5 kilograms of nitrogen in total protein per year. USDA guidelines say you only need 3 to survive and have a good life. Okay, I'm not talking about short, nasty, and brutish. I'm just talking about having a good life. Okay, and so if you combine those two, and you combine that into this, that reducing food waste and eating to USDA guidelines decreases another 25% to a total of 50%. And so you can say the top-down approach solves 25% of the nitrogen issue. The bottom-up approach at the consumer level solves another 25. It should be a no-brainer what is the most important, that both need to be done. Okay, so takeaway message. I've just told you this. I'll let you read it. This is segueing nicely into the personal footprint side. Allie is going to give this presentation. Allie graduated from the University of Virginia in 2009 with a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences. She's worked for the Nprint project for now 2.5 years, and she is the guiding force behind the development of the Nprint project. She has run workshops in 3 in the UK, in India, been around the world, and now has around 12 countries that she's working with in developing nitrogen footprints for their specific countries. So Allie, let me turn it over to you. I'll get unhooked here. And at the end, we will, both of us will take questions.
Sorry, give me a second here while I get set up. Okay, well, thank you, Jim, and thank you all again for inviting us here to give this seminar. We're very excited to be here. We've really enjoyed our time here. So I am going to be talking to you all about a personal nitrogen footprint model that we've been developing for a couple of years now, and we call this the N calculator. And at the bottom of the screen here, you can see our project team. We have a few goals in working on this project and while we're developing it. The first of these is really communicating the importance of nitrogen. The science of nitrogen is fairly well understood, but the public does not yet understand why nitrogen is important, how it's released to the environment, how it impacts the environment, and also how our daily choices impact those nitrogen losses. So the N calculator is really a tool to help bridge this gap between the scientific understanding and the public's understanding. We have a second practical goal of just actually calculating an entity's nitrogen footprint. That entity can be an individual, such as with the N calculator, or a community, institution, or even an entire country. And ultimately, we plan to look at these nitrogen losses in a region and link them to effects so that we can calculate nitrogen ceilings. NPRNT is the overarching name for a project that's in development that will ultimately be an integrated nitrogen footprint model that will have a few different parts. The first of these is the N calculator, which is the personal nitrogen footprint model. An in-progress model is the N producer, which will be a tool for producers such as farmers to calculate their nitrogen footprint and see how they might reduce it. And when we're looking at a region, we can then use data from both of those tools to see how that nitrogen, how it will be released, where it will be released, and ultimately the effects that it will have. And today, we're going to be focusing on the N calculator. So a good first question is, what is a nitrogen footprint? We define it as the total amount of nitrogen released to the environment as a result of an entity's resource consumption. And for the N calculator, we're looking at 4 main areas of consumption. The first of those is food, and that is really our focus, looking at nitrogen released from both the consumption and also the production of food. The other 3 sectors are driven by energy consumption and fossil fuel combustion, and those are housing, transport, and goods and services. We've developed 3 N calculators to date for the US, Netherlands, and Germany, and as Jim said, we have quite a few in development, quite a few in Europe, and also China, India, Tanzania, and a few other countries. So to take you through the calculation of a food nitrogen footprint, I thought I'd use something that I think we're all familiar with, a nutrition label. We see these, of course, on the back of the food items that we purchase at the grocery store. When we're calculating a food nitrogen footprint, we're looking at the amount of protein contained in that food. And this particular example is a slice of wheat bread, and we see it has 4 grams of protein. And because we know that protein is 16% nitrogen, you can see that you're consuming 0.6 grams of nitrogen here. And we assume that all protein and nitrogen that you're consuming is ultimately released to the environment as human waste, because the average adult is not typically going to be accumulating nitrogen. And the exception to that Jim talked about earlier is advanced sewage treatment that uses denitrification technology. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So this is the consumption side of the nitrogen footprint. The other side is the production side. This is all the nitrogen released from fertilizer runoff, processing waste, manure, food waste, and so on, a number of different pathways. And we refer to that as virtual nitrogen. We give it that name because it's all the nitrogen used in the process that does not end up in the final product that is actually consumed. Then we sum those 2 together to find that when you're consuming a slice of bread, you're ultimately releasing 1.4 grams of nitrogen to the environment. So bread doesn't have a whole lot of protein, so I thought we would take a look at an example that does. A beef patty here that has 21 grams of protein. From that, we can calculate the amount of nitrogen that's actually being consumed. And with Jim's leaky pipe example, and of course from the research you all do here, you know that the meat production process has higher nitrogen losses than crop production. So as you might expect, the virtual nitrogen associated with this beef patty is quite a bit higher. So then we can add those 2 together to find a total nitrogen footprint of 32 grams of nitrogen. So we developed what we call virtual nitrogen factors to describe the nitrogen released to the environment during the food production process. They describe the amount of nitrogen released per unit of nitrogen consumed. And we developed these for the major food categories. And in this, we're looking at conventional average agriculture in the US. So keep in mind that the goal of this tool is really for education and communication. So we're looking at an average here. This diagram is showing the process that we looked at for corn. And you can see that we started with the investment of new nitrogen into the system, and we see it's applied, and there are losses along the way. Some is recycled back, and ultimately you see how much of that nitrogen is consumed. We can then compare that to beef. And one thing I'd like to point out right here is that although this box looks bigger. The same amount of nitrogen is being invested in the system. There's just more recycling taking place in the beef production system. So a few things that are very apparent in this figure are that there are, of course, additional steps in the beef production process and bigger losses, especially for manure here, and much less nitrogen is ultimately consumed compared to the amount of nitrogen invested in both systems. And that's clearly reflected in the virtual nitrogen factors. For beef, for every unit of beef nitrogen that you consume, 8.5 units of nitrogen are being lost to the environment. So I've talked a bit about food. The other side of the N calculator is made up of the energy sectors. And there are three of those: housing, transport, and goods and services. And as I said earlier, this is driven entirely by fossil fuel combustion. And for most of the energy footprint, we really just need two pieces of information. It's a fairly straightforward calculation. We're looking at the amount of a resource that's being consumed. So how much electricity do you use each month? How far do you drive each week? And then we're looking at the appropriate associated emission factor based on, for example, the fuel mix in your area or the type of car that you drive. When we have those pieces of information, we can calculate the energy nitrogen footprint. So I'd like to share with you all the results of the U.S. per capita nitrogen footprint model. Across the x-axis here, you can see the different sectors of the footprint. And we've got kilograms of nitrogen per capita per year. And the blue bars here are the amount of nitrogen actually being consumed, your consumption footprint. And here we have the energy sectors. Now, of course, you know we must also add in the production side for food. And you can see that makes up the majority of a nitrogen footprint. The total nitrogen footprint in the U.S. is 41 kilograms of nitrogen per person per year. And I'd like to draw your attention to this figure that Jim mentioned, 5 kilograms of nitrogen, and keeping in mind that we only need 3 kilograms of nitrogen on average per year. And later on, I'm going to show the results of a scenario in which we reduced the current consumption level to the recommended consumption level. We talked a little bit about tertiary sewage treatment. If we were to install denitrification technology in all of the sewage treatment plants across the U.S., then we could reduce our food consumption footprint by about 70%. So immediately cut out about 3 kilograms of nitrogen there, which is a pretty significant reduction. But it's important to keep in mind that this could actually be a missed opportunity. A lot of resources and energy goes into the production of fertilizer, and it's also very energy intensive and expensive to install this denitrification technology. So we could close the gap here and start using some of this waste as fertilizer. And I believe that this is done in Washington, and it's been a pretty successful program from what I've been told. And so that could be a way to help reduce nitrogen losses to the environment. And this figure shows the average footprint of a couple of selected countries. You can see the U.S. is by far the biggest, so we win or we lose depending on how you want to look at it. And Germany and Netherlands are quite a bit smaller for quite a few reasons. Generally, their consumption is lower in both food and energy, and the emission factors are generally lower. As Jim mentioned, they also have advanced sewage treatment throughout almost the entire country, removing about 70% of the nitrogen from their sewage. Then we also have a very preliminary estimate of a nitrogen footprint in India. As you would expect, this is much smaller than those for the developed countries. But a few things to keep in mind, though, are that the population in India is very large, and it's growing rapidly. And also, resource consumption and food consumption is going up, and especially, or somewhat, the increase in meat consumption. And as those go up, the environmental problems already being experienced in India will continue to grow if not addressed. Okay, so I'd now like to transition over to another nitrogen footprint model that we've been working on, and that's for the University of Virginia. This is part of UVA's Environmental Footprint Reduction Plan. And as far as we know, this is the first institution-level nitrogen footprint model that's been developed. And you can see here a list of the major activities that we included. And as we did for the N calculator, our focus here again was really on food. So in calculating this food nitrogen footprint, it was a bit different than the per capita model. We only wanted to look at the food actually being consumed at UVA dining facilities. So not total consumption of all the people at UVA, just the food at the UVA facilities. So to do that, we looked at purchase records, looked at the major dining halls and a few representative facilities like the cafes and coffee shops that we have. And we calculated the amount of food being consumed using purchase records and some estimates of food waste that we had. We then worked with our local sewage treatment plant to see what the nitrogen denitrification rate was at the plant. And they actually just completed an upgrade, so the denitrification rate is quite high now. And so that is a credit or a reduction to our footprint. And then we, of course, also had to calculate the virtual nitrogen released during the production of this food, which is not released in the actual bounds of the university, but is still part of our footprint because our consumption is driving that food's production. And in the virtual nitrogen footprint, we were also including the food waste and transport, so food miles. One really interesting aspect that I learned about while working on this project is that quite a bit of food recycling goes on at UVA. And from the discussions I've had with you all today, it sounds like there are some similar efforts here at Washington State. And we're composting a good chunk of our food waste. So that's being repurposed as fertilizer. And we're also donating a lot of excess food that was prepared but not consumed to a program called Campus Kitchen. So we take all of that food recycled food and we just subtract it out of our nitrogen footprint. And so that's a great opportunity to reduce a nitrogen footprint. And then quite a few other sectors here. For these, we relied quite a bit on UVA's carbon footprint that was calculated using the Clean Air Cool Planet tool. This is all pretty straightforward. Utility usage, looking at the total electricity being used, total fuel burned, looking at our public transit system for transportation and commuting, looking at the fertilizer applied on grounds. And you can see I have this picture of our football field here. I imagine this is where most of the fertilizer at our university goes. Then end deposition, just using an average rate, looking at our research animals in our labs, the nitrogen they're consuming. And the final piece is going to be a stormwater calculation that we almost have completed. So the total nitrogen footprint of UVA in 2010 was 430 metric tons of nitrogen. You can see the biggest part of the footprint here is food production, making up 47% of the footprint. But the picture here is quite different than what we saw in the per capita nitrogen footprint model because utilities are a very big chunk. And that's because we have so many buildings at UVA, universities consume a lot of energy. We also have labs and also a hospital that's affiliated with our university. And so there are really a lot of opportunities there. Technology is available to reduce these nitrogen emissions, and that's one area where we can really reduce our nitrogen footprint. The rest of the sectors are quite small, the biggest being food consumption, but as I mentioned, our sewage treatment plant just finished an upgrade. So this food consumption sector is going to decrease to about 1% of the total footprint. And we thought it'd be interesting to do a little comparison of what the nitrogen footprint of UVA might have been when the institution was first established. Actually, it was established in 1819, but the first classes started in 1825. And this was an image of around that time of the lawn at UVA. You can see the rotunda in the back. And at that time, all of the faculty and students at the university lived right along this lawn in the pavilions and the dorms. And here's a picture today, and you can see the rotunda again. And faculty and students still live along the lawn here. I think a very neat tradition that's continued on. In 1825, we calculated the footprint within the bounds of the university to be about 3 metric tons of nitrogen, looking at food consumption for all of the people at the university, nitrogen deposition, and BNF for the part of the land of the university that had not yet been developed at that time. Today, looking at nitrogen just released within the bounds, it's about 95 metric tons of nitrogen. So as you can see, the activities, as you would expect, of the university have changed quite a bit over the past almost 200 years. And as I've mentioned, UVA is already doing quite a few things to reduce its nitrogen footprint. We have our food recycling programs that we're working on expanding. One neat event that they started a couple of years ago is Meat Free Mondays. Every Monday they have a station at the dining halls that has a vegetarian or vegan option. And we actually worked with them to calculate the nitrogen footprints of these meals so that students could have more information and be informed when they are making their food choices. The sewage treatment plant is going through its upgrades or just finished them. And on the energy side, for the environmental footprint reduction plan, a carbon footprint has already been calculated, and a reduction target of 25% reduction in carbon was established to be met by 2025. So in reducing that energy consumption to meet that carbon goal, our nitrogen footprint is also going to reduce quite a bit. And in the spring of this year, the UVA established a nitrogen working group. And the goal of this working group is to complete the model, establish our reduction goal, and then we're going to present that to the Sustainability Committee at UVA to make it an official goal of the university. And so we think it would be great to have this nitrogen footprint model extended to WSU. We think there are a lot of opportunities here, a lot of great data here, and it would be very interesting to have another university calculate their nitrogen footprint. But now I'm hoping that you're wondering what you can do to reduce your nitrogen footprint. The first thing you can do is calculate your footprint at our website, n-print.org. On the energy side, the suggestions for reducing your footprint are pretty similar to what you hear for reducing your carbon footprint. So reduce your utility usage, use public transit or walk, and so on. You really have more control on the food side because it makes up a bigger part of your nitrogen footprint. And the two I've folded here are two scenarios we're going to look at in just a second. And if we reduce our consumption to the recommended level and also reduce our food waste, that can have a really big impact. And our food choices are, of course, also important in determining our nitrogen footprint. And it's important to remember that doing any of these, even 1 day a week, can have a big difference over time. So we're now going to run our food consumption scenarios. And we have the scenarios on the x-axis here in kilograms of nitrogen per capita per year. The blue bar is the amount of nitrogen actually being consumed, about 5 kilograms of nitrogen per person per year now. And the red bar is the virtual nitrogen released during production. The first scenario, we're keeping the consumption exactly the same. Same foods, same amount. And we're reducing your food waste in half. And you can see that's already a 13% reduction in your footprint. So all you really need to do for that is just be more aware of how much food you're buying and what's actually in your fridge, the moldy bits that are in the back of the fridge that are easy to forget about sometimes. For the next scenario, we're taking the same types of food and reducing that 5 to the recommended 3 kilograms of nitrogen. You can see that has a very big impact on reducing your nitrogen footprint, reducing it by over 40%. And then finally, if we combine those two scenarios, that's a total of a 50% reduction in your nitrogen footprint. And of course, this isn't something that everyone will take on, I don't think, but it's great to see that this is what the opportunity is for individuals that are informed and really that it's important to them to reduce their nitrogen losses. And a quick announcement for those of you attending the workshop tomorrow. It'd be great if you could calculate your nitrogen footprint before the workshop and bring me your results at the beginning, and also bring your laptop so we can run some scenarios there. And finally, a few concluding thoughts. Humans are now dominating the introduction of reactive nitrogen to the environment. We're creating more reactive nitrogen than nature is. And this is, of course, causing a rapid rate of environmental change. And this change is only being magnified by the nitrogen cascade. There are many things that we can do today. We have the technology, and we can address many of these nitrogen losses. However, additional technology and also the public will and communication will be necessary to ultimately reduce these nitrogen losses. And a key challenge is the communication of the nitrogen story to all the stakeholders. We need to communicate why nitrogen is important, the impacts it can have on the environment, how it's released, and also how we can change our daily habits to reduce nitrogen losses. So thank you for your attention, and we'd be happy now to take any questions you all might have.
So let's say I'm going to choose whether or not to lower my carbon footprint or my nitrogen footprint. What would you say I should do and why?
Is there another question?
Sure. Well, really just about anything you're doing to reduce your carbon footprint is also going to reduce your nitrogen footprint. So if you pick one, you're also going to have impacts in the other. The main difference between the two is that the carbon footprint is more focused on energy consumption, and the nitrogen footprint is more focused on food. But you'll see benefits in both regardless of what you pick. I would, of course, tell you to pick nitrogen, but...
I mean, is the effects of my nitrogen output more disastrous than the effects of my carbon output, or...
Helpful.
Yeah. So that's a nice way of phrasing the question also. So carbon, of course, is a global issue. And so you have effects beyond the local environment. Nitrogen is much more regional, local and regional, but there's also a global aspect. So nitrogen losses to the environment contribute to nitrous oxide, contribute to ozone. Those are the direct impacts on the radiative forcing in the atmosphere. There's a wide variety of indirect and poorly understood consequences due a lot to aerosol loading and the color of the aerosols. And so it's really not an either or. I think it gets down to a resource consumption level. And so as citizens, what should be going through our brains, my view, is that, well, so what's the consequence of the consumption of this resource? What's the consequence of this overconsumption of this resource? So I'm not suggesting that we all become, hermits living in a cave eating whatever crawls into our mouths. That's a little bit extreme, but some conscious thought is appropriate. Yeah.
So I do a little module that's much smaller scale in the class that I teach in sustainable agriculture, and one of the things that the students pointed out that I think is interesting about doing these sort of life cycle assessments is how far out you go. So when you calculate your footprint, for example, for local food, depending on the season, I think Rich Parag did a nice study here in Seattle about, if you have wild salmon, asparagus, and apples, where would you get them from? So how do you relate your footprint to those kind of concepts? So it might be cheaper, ironically, in global footprint greenhouse gas calculations to take the apple from New Zealand in the middle of winter instead of going with the cold storage from Washington State. So how do you guys handle that? And then from a perspective of local people and local employment, how do you balance the two? And maybe there is no answer.
So I think there's lots of layers to the questions you just asked, but I think one of the layers was what's the we know about the local food movement, lots of great things about local food, but what's the nitrogen footprint relative to food from somewhere else versus local food? And that is, I never remember these numbers, but Allie remembers them very well.
Sure. So if we're looking at local food in terms of a nitrogen footprint, for our total food production footprint, only 5% of that is related to fossil fuel combustion. And of that, only 5% of that is then related to the final transport. So it's a very small percentage of the food production nitrogen footprint related to actual transportation of food. So nitrogen is not a reason for local food, but there are many other good reasons for it, of course. And we don't take into account where the food is produced in this model.
Yeah,
We just have...
There's a lot of components. Yeah, you have to have a lot of money.
Nitrous oxide is quite related to carbon footprint. It's about 300 times in mass ratio with carbon dioxide. So it is understood why we consider N2O, but why we consider ammonia, for example, it is not reactive with ozone, is not affecting the radiation in the upper layers, or so why ammonia is the other reactive species of nitrogen are considered in the nitrogen footprint.
Okay, so on the climate change issue, impacts on the radiative balance of the atmosphere, you're right, it's nitrous oxide, 300 times more important than CO2 on a per molecule basis. Then there's also ozone. Ammonia actually does have an impact on the radiative balance and the creation of aerosols. And so sulfuric aerosol versus ammonium sulfate aerosol has a different impact on the radiative balance. And so there's a role there. It's slight, and there's some uncertainty about it. But the broader question about a reactive nitrogen molecule of ammonia or ammonium gets to the nitrogen cascade that I showed you. Okay, that there's no impact, let's say there's no impact on climate change, but ammonia in the atmosphere is going to have an impact on visibility. It's going to have an impact on the acidity of soils once it's deposited, on the acidity of waters once it's nitrified, and then on the productivity of coastal ecosystems. And so one of the real challenges, and we didn't really talk about this in the talk, but one of the real challenges of when you have this multidimensional issue, environmental response issue, for an element that's critically needed for society is, and you want to solve one problem, when you solve that problem, you have to make sure that you're not exacerbating another problem due to your focus on that. And the classic example, of course, is the hog lagoons on the eastern part of the United States in a state that I won't name, but it's right south of Virginia. Okay, and so and north of South Carolina, and so for those of you who are geography limited, so they had a problem with too much ammonium getting to the coastal systems. And so they bubbled air through the hog waste lagoons and strips the ammonia right out in the atmosphere. And so less nitrogen getting coastal systems, but increasing the ammonia balance of the atmosphere for long-range transport. And so it's this integrated management approach that's so critical to do.
Jim?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
You mentioned the U.S. assessment report that you just finished. How do you think that's going to be consumed, if you will, by the policymakers, and where do you think that might lead?
Oh, Brian, that's an interesting question. So this report was released in August, given to the administrator of EPA. They're supposed to have a response back in a few weeks to the Science Advisory Board, which reports to the administrator of EPA. And so we have been asking about where the letter is from the administrator to the Science Advisory Board, saying whether the EPA was going to take these recommendations. I didn't go to the recommendations, but there are pretty substantial recommendations that require the government to be serious about it. And I actually talked to the Science Advisory Board, what's today, Monday. I talked to them on Friday. I said, we're going to give this seminar at WSU. We'd love to be able to tell what the administrator's response was. And they said, well, let you know when we get it. And they didn't contact me. So I don't know. I think that there should be, well, I still believe in the Easter Bunny, but they should accept it, okay, because it's things like interagency task force on nitrogen point to this integrated nitrogen management issue. Intra-agency, you know, the pillars within EPA talking to each other, setting a target for a 25% reduction in reactive nitrogen use in the United States in a reasonable time frame, 10 years. I mean, these are not difficult to do. But I think, I don't know, I can't even, well, I can speculate a lot why we haven't heard the result. So I don't know.
Given that this is a regional issue, wouldn't it make more sense that states and localities, local governments, would be taking on this issue? And also, kind of a second question, why do you think that carbon gets all the love and nobody talks about nitrogen?
So should states and local governments be involved? Why shouldn't they be involved in the issue? They certainly should, okay? And it needs to have not just this top-down, which not just the federal government, but also the state and local government, but this bottom-up. So it really is a multidimensional issue. You know, take an example, Brian mentioned the acid rain stuff. One of the reasons that the Clean Air Act amendments were so effective is that you got state buy-in to decreases of SO2 emissions. And so, yeah, that's important. On the question of why is carbon loved so much and nitrogen the poor child off to the side, think about how long it took for carbon to become loved. You know, how long has the community, the scientific community in this case, been talking about impacts of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere? This began in the 19th century. Okay, this is not new stuff. And it's taken a very long time to get to a stage of a Kyoto Protocol. And still, there are some significant countries that have not signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. And so nitrogen's coming along. That's why this communication side is so critical in being able to craft the message, and why when someone says, well, why nitrogen? It's important to be able to talk about resource use, personal responsibility, and I dare say human health relative to this overconsumption of protein. Allie, anything to add?
Other questions?
Yes.
I'm just curious if there's been any effort to integrate this handprint model into, I guess, overall environmental models to come up with some threshold values. Say, what's the maximum level of population, or what's the maximum level of cattle stock, like the country or like environment, like the earth can sustain, and what the actions should be to change things.
That's tomorrow's job. No, what we have done is we're talking to the people who have other types of footprints, water, carbon, the ecological footprint, and saying, well, how can we put these together into some more global footprint? but it's complicated because there are different models are used. Relative to the broader question you're asking, no, that's something beyond at least my abilities to do, but certainly it's something needed to do, and certainly it's an opportunity for those of you who are students here to put your very creative minds to. And on that note, let us thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to any questions afterwards.